Number 8. Capuchin mummies. It's not uncommon for archaeologists to uncover crypts beneath monasteries. Over the years, plenty of people get buried underneath old monasteries and abbeys, but the discovery of catacombs under the Capuchin monastery in the Czech Republic wasn't the only surprise laying in wait for investigators. In the medieval crypt, multiple bodies of monks were found undisturbed, but surprisingly, they weren't placed inside coffins. Keeping with traditional burial practices, the monks were known to remove the bodies of their dead brothers from their coffins and place them on the ground so the next to be buried could be laid to rest. Hundreds of years ago, the brothers at the monastery started to bury their dead this way, with the practice continuing into the late 18th century. Instead of the traditional burial you and I are accustomed to, the bodies are placed with a stone slab under their head to prop them up. With their hands crossed over their bodies clutching a rosary, they are left to rest in this natural way. When they were discovered, some of the monks were still dressed in their ceremonial robes. But you might wonder how the bodies remained this way without decaying, right? The underground chamber has a system of ventilation ducts that allows the bodies to mummify, as well as soil that helps to keep the mummies from decaying. Although it might seem like a strange way to honor their dead, over time, 200 monks and followers of the religious order have been interred there. Of course, some of the bodies have been moved over the centuries, and now only 24 remain in the crypts. Number 7. Spiral skeletal burial. Dead bodies being placed in odd patterns are always unsettling, and recently 10 skeletons found in a burial site south of Mexico City were discovered in a particularly strange formation. Laid to rest in an archaeological site called Tlalpan, the bodies were found buried in a spiral, probably as some sort of religious or spiritual exercise, but for us today, it's just plain creepy. The bodies belonged to adults, a child and an infant, and were both female and male. Believed to be part of a ritualistic burial, they were arranged in a circular formation with their arm bones interlocked. 2 of the skeletons were found to have deformities in their skulls, with some of their teeth also deformed. I wonder if they had good dentists back thousands of years ago in Central America. Probably not. As experts studied their finds, they discovered the site dated back to the pre-classical period in Mexico, older than the Aztec Empire. An archaeologist who was part of the team that found the bodies in 2006 said the village associated with the burial lasted about 500 years, placing it between the Ticoman and Zacatenco phase in Mexico's history. Besides being bizarre and looking a bit occult, this strange find offers a unique glimpse into the burial practices of some of Mexico's first people, which has been very informative for archaeologists and anthropologists. Number 6. Peruvian sacrificial tunnel. Leave it to tiny robots to uncover one of the biggest discoveries tied to ancient Peru. A team of American and Peruvian archaeologists using tiny robots to search an ancient complex stumbled upon a network of tunnels below the 3,000-year-old Chavin de Huantar temple in 2018. But the tunnels weren't the only discovery made in the religious and administrative center. 3 skeletons, believed to have been victims of sacrifice, were also uncovered. Armed with cameras, the robots, which were designed by engineers at Stanford University, were sent into the underground tunnel network, where they found the bodies as well as ceramic fragments and tools. A whopping 35 tunnels make up the underground system dating back to between 1200 and 200 BC. Considered one of the most important discoveries of the last 50 years, the tunnels were said to have been used by priests to carry out rituals using noise and light to make it seem like they had mystical powers. Using remote controls to maneuver the robots, researchers found the bodies belonging to a small boy, a teenager, and a young man. Located in a narrow valley in the high Andes, the Chavin Temple is a protected UNESCO World Heritage Site that was first occupied around 5,000 years ago. But the tunnels were a marvel of innovation, with optical illusions, mirrors, and even psychoactive drugs used to influence visitors that their priests were godlike. Sunlight, roaring water, and elaborate stone carvings also brought an extra air of the supernatural to peasants who came from miles away to experience spiritual enlightenment. Even if some of it was a smokescreen, the important thing is that the site brought power and authority to the Peruvian people, and it would never have been found without the clever use of modern technology. Number 5. Kenyan burial mound. Most massive burial monuments are dedicated to kings or pharaohs, but a newly discovered burial mound in Kenya was made by the people for the people, with bodies of tribe members of all ages buried side by side. Known as the Lothagam North Pillar site, the mound is one of the earliest monumental sites in Eastern Africa. Made up of rocky rings, stone columns, and burial mounds, the site is home to generations of tribe members, roving herders who buried their dead by a lake in what is now Kenya. The oldest of 6 known monument sites built between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago, the cemetery has a 100-foot wide raised stone platform site capped with monolithic basalt and sandstone columns that experts believe were hauled from nearly a mile away. Inside the platform, a burial chamber that once held up to almost 600 graves was also found. First discovered in the 1960s, the site had been studied for decades, uncovering the bodies, which were buried with colorful jewelry, hippo ivory bangles, and elaborate headdresses. The most stunning piece found so far was a headpiece made of over 400 gerbil teeth. That's right, gerbil teeth. Imagine how much effort it would have taken to turn a bunch of minuscule teeth into headwear. With the discovery of the monument and its unique burials of elders buried with infants and women buried alongside men, Lothagam North is a fascinating monument that could reshape the perception of ancient societies. Number 4. Decapitated skeletons. Leave it to modern technology to identify and unlock the genes of more than 80 skeletons found in a Roman cemetery in England. All aged under 45 when they died, the skeletons of 80 individuals were first unearthed a decade ago, but it took until 2016 for their origins to be made clear. Using genome technology, the 1800-year-old skeletons, who were found underneath gardens at Driffield Terrace, were discovered to have Syrians and Palestinians among them. But it isn't their far-flung origins that stunned researchers. It's the fact that most of the men had been decapitated with their skulls tucked between their legs, placed at their feet, or laid on their chests. Found in York, which was once a major outpost on Rome's distant frontier, some of the bodies were linked to people living in modern-day Wales. Many of the skeletons had signs of healed injuries, with a few showing bite marks from a large predator like a lion or bear. But the most stunning discovery was that half of the bodies were decapitated just after they died. So why were they decapitated? Experts believe the site was once a special burial place for those who fought as gladiators in arenas until the late 4th century AD. How did they know that? Well, they seem to have stronger muscles in their right arms, a trait that Roman slaves who trained to fight as gladiators often had. Given the fact that bouts usually ended with the loser being decapitated, the discovery marks the location of the world's best preserved gladiator graveyard. Well, at least they were buried with their heads. Do you think you would have done well as a gladiator, or would you have been food for the lions and bears? Tell me how you'd try to survive down in the comments below. Then remember to subscribe to Talltanic if you haven't already for more awesome videos just like this one. Number 3. Palermo Catacombs. Mummification isn't just for the ancient Egyptians. It became a well-known practice in Sicily, where the Capn catacombs are located. One of the world's most well-known cultural heritage sites, these creepy catacombs of Palermo are the perfect place for fans of the macabre to visit. A cemetery for brothers of the convent of the Capuchin friars, this site is home to countless corpses of people who died between the 17th and 19th centuries. Originally built as a simple cemetery to bury the monks of the monastery, the friars first buried their dead in a mass grave under the altar of St. Anne. As the community grew, the pit quickly became overcrowded, so a larger cemetery was built to transfer the friars already buried. At that time, the friars made a startling discovery. 45 of the bodies had been naturally mummified without decomposing. Believing it was an act of God, the friars decided to display the bodies of their brothers as relics instead of burying the remains. You might think the burials took place in the ancient past, but up until 1782, the convent accepted burials from laypeople, expanding and adding more corridors. Thousands of wealthy citizens and local standout citizens could be buried there. But it wasn't cheap. It took generous donations to afford the mummification process. And later, the bodies were placed on eternal display in special nooks in the underground cemetery. Kind of bizarre, don't you think? Number 2. China's hanging coffins. In the southern Sichuan province of China, you might notice a strange sight when you look up in the opposing cliffs of the Yangtze River. 30 caskets that date back hundreds of years sit anchored to the limestone rocks almost 100 feet in the air. Both inside the coffins and attached to the outside, there are scraps of clothing, bones, and ceramics as tribute to those buried inside. Found across a large area of the remote valleys in central China, the coffins line the cliff face, balanced on wooden stakes or stacked high. The oldest of the coffins date back 3,000 years, but there is no clear explanation for why the dead were placed this way. Some ancient texts say that those placed higher on the cliffs were more devout in their religion, while others are a bit more practical. They say they were just placed there to keep them away from animals. Every year, new sites are discovered, with 131 found in 2015 in the province of Hubei alone. But that doesn't mean experts are any closer to figuring out how the people transported the coffins, the bodies, and all the funeral objects to the cliff caves. One researcher determined to figure out the mystery rappelled down a cliff face to get a closer look at some of the hanging coffins. Most rested on rotting stakes, which required bamboo scaffolding to secure the site before researchers could examine the strange boxes. When they did, they found some of the coffins had multiple bodies in them. Each one was dug out from a single solid piece of wood and packed with sand, which made them incredibly heavy. Even though it might seem like a strange practice, Tibetans and Mongolians practice a different type of sky burial where they offer the bodies of the deceased to vultures or other animals. But cliff burials, also found in the Philippines, are often only accessible by river, making one wonder exactly how the ancient people were able to transport them to these precarious final resting places. But that doesn't mean the coffins aren't targets for looters. At some sites, the coffins have been robbed for their valuable artifacts, including swords and other valuables. As much as researchers try to determine how and why these cliffside burials took place, one may never truly know why a few groups of people adopted this unique practice. Number 1. The Bone Church. If you're a fan of the macabre, the Sedlec Ossuary Bone Church is the place to be. Located in the Czech Republic, the church is made entirely of bones. That seems awfully occult and disturbing, right? 1 hour east of Prague, the cemetery was originally founded in 1142 as the oldest Cistercian monastery. At one point, almost 30,000 people were buried there, mostly victims of epidemics. As it grew in popularity as one of Europe's most sought-after burial places, a Gothic chapel and ossuary were built there too. But one look at the ossuary, the room where the bones of the deceased are kept, and you can see that it's no ordinary place. After a fire destroyed the cathedral and monastery, the bones were removed and stacked for safekeeping. But an architect and woodcarver brought in to recreate the interior of the church had a vision, one that saw them taking the bones of the dead and making something beautiful from them. Bleaching the bones, the woodcarver used them in his own style of macabre art, stringing skulls and bones across entryways. He also created elaborate candelabras and crosses made from femurs. The most striking piece in the place is a massive bone chandelier with skulls as candle holders. Between 40,000 and 70,000 bones make up the interior designs of the church, with visitors allowed to walk freely among the creepy decorations. To keep everything looking in tip-top shape, a specialist comes in periodically to clean every bone on the chapel with a toothbrush. If this site isn't too ghoulish, you can visit the church to marvel at the remains of so many real skeletons used in one man's morbid artistry.
10. Mysterious statues. On the mysterious Easter Island, located far off the coast of Chile, there are strange statues known as moai. These are typically known as the Easter Island heads, but did you know that they are actually more than just heads? Those giant heads are attached to bodies, which archaeologists found buried underneath the ground. But here's where things get really strange. The Easter Island statues were carved in such a position that they appear to be covering their private areas with their hands, and in the exact same way that the Urfa man, a strange statue found in modern Turkey, carved sometime around 9000 BC, covers his private area. The statues are basically identical, except that they were carved in very different times. The Urfa man was carved in the area that was once known as Mesopotamia by an unknown race of Neolithic people. It's actually the oldest natural sculpture of a human that is life-sized. To compare, the Easter Island statues were made only about 1,000 years ago by a group of Polynesians who settled on the island. So the big question becomes, why were two statues built, almost identical, 8,000 years apart by two different groups of people who never met each other? Is it just a big coincidence, or were the Polynesians somehow influenced by those who lived in early Mesopotamia? And if so, how in the world did that happen? 9. Pyramids around the world. Every civilization from the ancient world built pyramids. There's no getting around it. Mesopotamia, Egypt, Maya, Aztec, Inca, Nubia, Babylonia. They all built pyramids. The Babylonians built something called a ziggurat, from the Babylonian word for tall. The first ones were constructed in the 21st century BC, making ziggurats some of the oldest pyramids in the world. But how did the idea for a tall structure with many tiers shaped like a triangle get passed down from the Babylonians to the Egyptians? And how did the notion of building pyramids then spread across the ocean to the Americas, where literally every culture built some kind of pyramid, usually using them for religious temples? To this day, nobody has been able to answer the question. It makes sense that people in the Mediterranean world built pyramids, and even the Nubians with their small, black, pointy pyramids, since they were neighbors with the Egyptians. The fact that they were built as far as China and on the other side of the world by cultures who had never had any contact with the Eastern world is pretty strange. One of the only things that makes sense is that there was some kind of outside influence that inspired and maybe even helped the emerging cultures of the early world to build pyramid structures. Who this influence was is up for debate, with some people claiming aliens, and some claiming an ancient race of powerful beings called the Anunnaki. 8. The Eternal Spiral. The spiral is a global coincidence and one of the oldest symbols found anywhere in the world. It is one of the most common geometric patterns that has been painted and carved in every region of the world since prehistoric times. However, there is a lot of speculation over the meaning of the spiral symbol. Some say it represented the sun, which does make sense, considering the sun was something everyone on Earth could clearly see. Others believed it represented space and the galaxy, with ancient people looking to the stars and then drawing what they saw there. Others still believed the spiral had a more functional purpose, perhaps used as some kind of calendar that separated time in the swirling chapters, seasons, and solstices. Where has this spiral figure been found? It's been popular for at least 6,000 years and found all across Europe in the earliest Neolithic art around. The Celtic people drew spirals in almost everything in Ireland, from burial chambers to standing stones. One of the oldest spiral symbols ever is 18,000 years old, found engraved on a mammoth tusk in Siberia. Even more, societies all over the world created spiral monuments like complex mazes, everywhere from North Carolina to ancient England, and places like the Drumbeg Stone Circle in County Cork, Ireland. To this day, we can only guess at what the fascination was with the spiral, though it almost certainly had something to do with early cultures representing the universe. 7. Mushrooms everywhere. Mushrooms are everywhere and hiding in plain sight, all across the globe. From pre-Columbian art to ancient India, mushrooms can be seen depicted in all kinds of different ways. Even in China, there are humanoid figurines with mushrooms growing out of their heads. Some historians believe that mushrooms held great meaning in almost all ancient societies where they grew. This is especially true for the Harappan civilization, one of the earliest in South Asia. They flourished from between 2500 and 1500 BC and worshipped a plant called soma, which was a hallucinogenic mushroom eaten throughout Siberia and the other nearby regions. Because the mushroom had psychedelic effects, it was treated like a deity. A plant deity also played a huge role in Persian mythology. It was called Haoma, and it actually came from the Indo-Iranian people, from the same ancient society that worshipped the soma mushroom. Even in Hindu mythology, Shiva, the supreme being, is often depicted holding a mushroom in her right hand. The Buddha can even be seen in many different statues as part of a mushroom. But what's really surprising is that the mushroom cult goes all the way to Mexico, where the Maya had a weird fascination with the fungus as well. Could it be that all these ancient cultures were actually obsessed with eating mushrooms and hallucinating? Or was there a more complicated, deeper meaning behind the mushrooms found everywhere in the iconography of these ancient societies? Why do you think mushrooms have been portrayed in so many different cultures over the years? Let us know in the comments below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. 6. Egyptians and Aztecs. There are some rather strange coincidences between the Aztecs and the ancient Egyptians. The Egyptians came way before the Aztecs, but the two had a lot in common. And so too did the Maya and the Inca, but it doesn't really make a lot of sense. For example, the three major Mesoamerican cultures didn't appear until the 13th century, 2,000 years after Egypt had already fallen out of its prime. Yet, they had some very similar principles. For example, the Egyptians used two main calendars, a religious calendar and a civil calendar. The religious calendar was for keeping the dates of holidays and festivals and tracking the moon, while the civil calendar recorded the amount of time that a pharaoh was in power, as well as agricultural periods. Similarly, the Aztecs had two calendars, their sacred calendar that tracked days that their gods needed sacrifices, and an agricultural calendar to keep track of when harvesting needed to be done. The weirdest part is that both cultures' calendars function on a schedule of 360 days, with these days spread into 18 months. There are honestly too many similarities to even get into, from the use of tombs and pyramids to the religious cults and the similar way both the Egyptians and the Aztecs used metal to decorate much of their artwork. 5. Curious clamps. Speaking of metal, evidence that the ancient cultures of the world had access to metal building supplies is overwhelming. In a bizarre coincidence, many countries, thousands of miles apart, seem to have used metal clamps when building their complicated structures, though none of these clamps have ever actually been found. Evidence of metalwork has been discovered in modern Egypt, Greece, Ethiopia, Armenia, Cambodia, Bolivia, Peru, and even Iran. Even though the metal clamps themselves have long since been removed or pillaged, the markings they left behind are still there. These markings are basically indents, the leftover impressions made by what must have been metal clamps that held huge pieces of stone together. According to archaeologists, tests revealed the clamp impressions were molds in which metal was poured, thereby binding two massive pieces of rock. And if you don't believe me, scientists even found metal still present in Ethiopia inside some of these clamp depressions. The metal is very specific too, crafted from copper, nickel, arsenic, and even iron. But what makes this so unbelievable is that these metals are not widely available in many of the regions where they were used, suggesting somebody else gave the technology to the ancient builders, allowing them to construct biblical-sized monuments, propelling them out of the Stone Age. 4. A history of priests. One of the weirder historical coincidences is that every single place in the world, beginning thousands of years ago, had priests and priestesses as part of their society. Priests have existed since the invention of agriculture, maybe even before that. Some of the earliest known priestesses go back to ancient Sumer, to 2285 BC. The Sumer were really the first ones to make priests and priestesses as important in society as the king or queen. Many kings were also head priests. The coincidence here is that it happened in every society. For an unknown reason, civilizations decided they needed spiritual leaders who would interact with the gods and be in charge of the temples. Egyptian priests staffed temples and gave offerings to the gods, while priests in the Mesoamerican cities of the Maya, Inca, and Aztecs were the ones to deal in human sacrifices. As for ancient Greece, the priestesses were treated a little differently. They were oracles who gave prophecies, and some of the only respected women in all of classical Greece. The point is that wherever there have been people, there have been specially selected individuals chosen to be in charge of religious activities, and it's still going on today. 3. The Maya-China link. The Maya and the Chinese have a lot in common. At least the ancient societies did. According to Jose Enrique Ortiz Lanza with the National Institute of Anthropology and History of Mexico, both ancient cultures had a weird fascination with jade. In Mexico, archaeologists have discovered dead bodies of the Maya covered in masks made of jade, while in Chinese tombs, archaeologists have found dead nobles encased in full suits of jade. But the similarities don't end there. Both the Maya and the Chinese had a high respect for the elderly, with the Mayans inadvertently following some of the teachings of Confucianism. And then there are the gods they worshipped. The Mayan moon goddess Ixchel was almost always depicted as being accompanied by a rabbit, while the Chinese moon goddess Chang'e was also accompanied by a rabbit. They were basically twins, which seems impossible since the two cultures never even met. How could they both have thought of the exact same goddess being accompanied by a rabbit? It seems inconceivable. But for this coincidence, there is a theory. Some archaeologists believe the Mayans actually came from East Asia across the Bering Strait, and that they brought some of the ancient Chinese beliefs with them. There's no evidence of this theory yet, but it's one of the only explanations anyone can come up with, considering there are so many similarities between the two cultures. 2. Anunaki Handbag. One of the strangest symbols found throughout the ancient world, believe it or not, is an image that looks a lot like a modern handbag. The shape of the handbag can be seen in depictions all the way from the ancient Sumerians who lived in what is today Iraq, to the Maori of New Zealand, and even the Olmec culture of Central America. The handbags are seen in carvings of powerful figures, and nobody is really sure what they mean. The first known example of a handbag appearing in an ancient carving comes from the very end of the last Ice Age. The oldest handbag of them all was found in the ruins of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, carved onto stone in 11,000 BC. To make things even more mysterious, nobody knows the purpose of the mountain ruins in which the carving was discovered. Some believe the handbag is a representation of the cosmos. This is because they are almost always seen being held by a god or mythical deity. The gods hold these handbags in the same way a person would hold a basket, and one of the theories is that the basket or handbag actually contains the sacred knowledge of the gods. These gods, some claim, are actually the ancient race of beings known as the Anunnaki, who are said to be the original creators of humankind. 1. Egyptians in the Grand Canyon. Here's a question. Did the Egyptians cross the ocean and land in the American Southwest thousands of years ago? A discovery in the early part of the 20th century suggests that such a thing may have happened. According to a story published in the Arizona Gazette back in 1909, archaeologists funded by the Smithsonian believe that they found proof of an Egyptian civilization that lived inside the Grand Canyon. The archaeologists allegedly discovered a series of caves filled with artifacts that proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Egyptians were living in America. The archaeologists found tablets that were engraved with hieroglyphics, though these tablets were eventually lost and never recovered. Today, the Smithsonian actually denies that it ever happened. So, there are either two possibilities. Either a small Egyptian colony really did find their way to the Grand Canyon, and the tablet artifacts were real, and the Smithsonian is lying about it for an unknown reason, or it never happened at all. But would the Smithsonian truly have destroyed artifacts and denied a real scientific finding just to change the official narrative? There are rumors that in 1892, a series of mysterious coffins were found in Alabama, turned over to the Smithsonian Institute, and then lost under dubious circumstances. So, it seems anything is possible. Number 9. Well of Santa Christina. During the 12th or 11th century BC, a culture called the Nuragic civilization built a shrine complex near the modern-day commune of Poli Latino in Sardinia, Italy. Dubbed the Well of Santa Christina, this fascinating, well-preserved, modern-looking monument sits on a basaltic plateau. It was built with seemingly perfect proportions and geometry, making it seem like a much newer structure than it actually is. An elliptical enclosure made from rocks, called a temenos, surrounds a trapezoidal staircase that leads underground and gets more and more narrow as it descends. The entrance is covered by architraves, which look like an upside-down staircase. At the bottom of the stairs, there's a well that sits beneath a 23-foot-high dome. The Nuragic culture lasted from the 18th century BC to the 2nd century AD, and its surviving architecture reflects a society of remarkably skilled masons. But because the Nuragic people left no written records, the true meaning of the Santa Christina is a complete mystery. It's clear that the structure was sacred, and that it probably served as a ceremonial meeting site. But the exact beliefs that inspired the well's design and construction are unknown. Since the well is the site's focal point, scholars theorize that it was used by a water cult. They also believe that the structure may have been an astronomical observatory, because sunlight shines down the water every year during the equinoxes. Every 18.6 years, during an event called a lunar standstill, The moonlight shines through an opening at the very top of the well. Unfortunately, without documented sources, this is probably as close as we'll ever get to understanding the Nuragic civilization's spiritual views. Number 8. Juanitos Las Yamas. Over 500 years ago, sometime between 1400 and 1450, 3 adults and 269 children between the ages of 5 and 14 years old were sacrificed in a ritual in northeastern Peru. The gruesome event would eventually become known as the largest mass child sacrifice ever discovered. When local pizzeria owner Michael Spano noticed human bones in a vacant lot near his home, he contacted archaeologist Gabriel Prieto, whose team spent 8 years excavating the site. It quickly became clear that the mass burial was carried out by the Chimu culture, yet the graves were not characteristic of typical Chimu burials. Instead of being buried upright, as was custom in their culture, the children were laid on their backs or curled up on their sides. Many had cut marks on their sternum and ribs. Pottery and other typical grave goods were absent from the burial, and numerous children were buried next to llamas and alpacas, which the Chimu people valued as a source of food and transportation. Like the children, the animals were slashed across the sternum. The Chimu culture is shrouded in mystery, complicating researchers' ability to determine the circumstances surrounding the massacre. The civilization left behind no written records, leaving modern experts to rely solely on artifacts and heavily biased observations recorded by Spanish conquistadors. To make things even more confusing, this is the first physical evidence of the Chimu culture ever sacrificing children. Researchers suspect that rising seas, heavy rains, and the severe effects of El Niño ravaged the society's political and economic well-being, prompting the Chimu people to act outside of tradition and sacrifice some of the most valuable assets, children and animals, in a desperate plea to the gods for relief. Number 7. Neolithic Menhirs. A menhir is a large, ancient, megalithic stone that stands upright. Also called standing stones, they are sometimes found alone, with no other rocks nearby, or as part of a circular or linear arrangement. While excavating ahead of a construction project in Valais, Switzerland, recently, a team of archaeologists came across a formation of 13 medium-sized menhirs. The rocks are currently undergoing scientific dating procedures to determine their age, but experts believe that they were erected during the Neolithic or Bronze Age. Their exact meaning and purpose are unknown. The discovery happened in the commune of St. Leonard, in a region that was especially active during Neolithic times. In 2019, archaeologists identified a linear arrangement of 6 menhirs in the town of Sion, just a few miles from St. Leonard. The largest stone found in Sion weighs nearly 2.2 tons and features an engraving of a male figure with a sun-like motif surrounding his face. Another menhir is covered in numerous small circular depressions. Similar markings have been found in Italy, but this is the first and only time they've ever been seen in France. A press release revealed that some of the stones appear to be deliberately broken. It's possible that they were repurposed for other building projects, but nobody knows for sure. The mystery of why people broke the menhirs has lingered since 1961, when 30 standing stones and several collective tombs, known as dolmens, were found just 1,300 feet from the site. Researchers concluded their analysis of the 6 menhirs by stating that the question remains open. Do you have any idea what these menhirs were used for? What do you think they represented? Let us know in the comments below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. Number 6. An urban precinct. During the Hellenistic period between 305 BC and 30 BC, Egypt experienced its first building boom. After the death of the last Ptolemaic ruler, Cleopatra VII, Rome conquered Egypt. The Roman-Byzantine presence lasted until the 7th century, when Islamic rule entered the region. By then, Egypt had many long-established urban settlements. Simply put, there was no need to build more population centers, so no new cities sprang up from late antiquity onward. New settlements were extremely rare. So, archaeologists were a little shocked to discover a well-planned urban precinct dating back to the late 6th century in Marea, an ancient port settlement and industrial center to the west of Alexandria. Excavations at the site have been ongoing since the 1970s, but this is the first settlement of its type to be found there. According to newly published research, it was built over the ruins of a Roman farm and winery. The precinct was filled with one-story modular buildings from between the 6th and 8th centuries. Occupying some 32 acres, the site may have contained neatly lined shops, houses and structures that were used by Christian pilgrims. A noskomeon, or hospital, along with public baths and toilets, testified to the urban planners' concern for public health. Even the seasoned experts who work at Morea describe the unlikely discovery as rare and a big surprise. Number 5. Moon tracking stones of Mull. Scotland's Isle of Mull is home to an array of mysterious prehistoric stone monuments, including a stone circle and several collections of standing stones. Archaeologists believe that the sites were built around 3,000 years ago, but their exact age and purpose are a mystery. Some scholars think that the arrangements were built for tracking the moon's path year-round. They've determined that several of the standing stone collections are positioned for following the lunar cycle, which is closely linked with the tides and fertility cycles. But this only partially explains the function of these sites. Crystal and quartz shards have been found near several of the monuments. One theory holds that they were smashed against the standing stones during rituals, possibly to reflect a nearby fire or the moon. Some experts have even suggested that the stones represented portals to the underworld. Since Neolithic times, quartz was valued for its believed ability to connect with the afterlife, according to a Dig It Scotland article by archaeologist Claire Ellis. The mineral has also been found at Neolithic ritual sites in other parts of Scotland and in Ireland. Since there are no written records from these early populations, all experts can do is speculate about what really went on at these sites and why. Number 4. Plain of Jars. Deep in the mountains of northern Laos, a seemingly surreal landscape known as the Plain of Jars is dotted with over 3,000 megalithic jars. Scattered along the central plain of the Chiang Khoang Plateau, the huge bizarre vessels sometimes stand alone and are seen in clusters of up to several hundred. Most are made from sandstone, but some were carved from granite and limestone. They were discovered during the 1930s and have perplexed scholars ever since. The jars were originally dated back to sometime between 1240 and 660 BC, but their true age is unknown. Their purpose is also a mystery. While some researchers believe they may have been used in prehistoric burials, local legend claims that the vessels stored food, alcohol, rainwater, and other things. It's difficult to study the jars because they are situated among thousands or perhaps millions of unexploded Vietnam-era bombs. Less than 10% of them have been thoroughly investigated, but excavations are on the rise as archaeologists pinpoint sites that are safe to explore, and research is becoming more accurate thanks to advanced technology. Some of the jars have been reliably traced to the 2nd millennium BC. Meanwhile, some human skeletons and bundled and jarred collections of bones were recently dated between the 9th and 13th centuries AD. Previous research dated other human remains to around the same age as the jars. The findings show that in some cases, the jars predate the human remains by thousands of years. Researchers can't explain this time discrepancy, but they think the jars were reused repeatedly over time, and that the sites maintained ritual significance over many centuries. The identity of the people who created the vessels is a mystery. Scholars are also trying to figure out how people moved the jars to their current locations from the quarry they were sourced from 5 miles away. With each jar standing at up to 10 feet tall and weighing as much as 33 tons, it seems like an impossible task in the absence of modern machinery. Number 3. Amazon rock paintings. Around 12,000 years ago, indigenous people living in what is now southeastern Colombia covered miles of rock wall with thousands of paintings. The images mostly depict Ice Age beasts, including mastodons, giant sloths, camelids, and horses. There are also humanoid figures, hunting scenes, geometric shapes, and other animals such as deer, alligators, bats, monkeys, turtles, porcupines, and more. Made with red ochre pigment, the paintings have survived into modern times. They comprise the largest collection of rock art in the Americas. Indigenous locals have long known about the images, which they consider part of their heritage, and regional experts began studying the site decades ago. But the outside world first learned about the artwork recently last year, when the press erroneously described it as a new discovery. Some of the murals were painted so high up, they required the use of special ladders. They were created by hunter-gatherers who survived on fish, reptiles, mammals, and fruit. The artwork is an invaluable component of the researchers' ongoing quest to determine who the Amazon's first settlers were. Sadly, the failure to acknowledge and consult those who already knew about it makes it seem as though the project is already off on the wrong foot. Researchers are still working to interpret the meaning of the images. Meanwhile, tensions seem to be growing between locals and outsiders, who are eager to offer their opinion, but seemingly less willing to listen. While some scholars simply see extinct megafauna, others believe the murals depict more modern species. For example, what looks like a giant sloth to some seems like a capybara to others. Some contend that the artwork conveys a deeper representation, such as the conflict between indigenous people and Spanish colonizers. Whatever the case though, it's clear that more investigation is needed to come to any sort of definitive conclusion. Number 2. A Lost Kingdom. According to Greek mythology, anything King Midas touched turned to gold. But his penchant for the finer things in life eventually caught up to him, and as a consequence, he died of starvation. A Phrygian ruler named King Midas really did exist during the 8th century BC, according to historical sources, which claim that he was married to a Greek princess and traded extensively with the Greeks. He allegedly committed suicide. But archaeological evidence of the king's existence is scarce at best, leaving researchers with little to work with in terms of distinguishing fact from fiction. A possible major breakthrough came in 2019 when archaeologists discovered the remnants of a lost kingdom at a mound site in Turkey called Turkmen Karahoyuk. A local farmer tipped experts off to the presence of a large stone, or stele, with strange inscriptions that had appeared in a nearby canal. They made a beeline for the site and immediately recognized the artifact's carvings as Luwian, a Bronze and Iron Age language specific to the region. The hieroglyphs describe the defeat of the Anatolian kingdom of Phrygia around 3,000 years ago. Evidence suggests that the stele may reference the king Midas, who is known for his golden touch. According to the text, a rival ruler named Hartapu captured Midas. Who Hartapu was and what kingdom he ruled, nobody knows. But the story suggests that the site became Hartapu's capital following his conquest of Phrygia. The findings are preliminary, but offer a promising start to learning more about this ancient society that was lost to history until now, and the enemy king who is so often mentioned in stories, but conspicuously absent from historical records. Number 1. World's oldest war memorial. During the 3rd millennium BC, 30 fallen soldiers were laid to rest with a collection of grave goods in a massive burial mound, located near the Euphrates River in what is now the Syrian town of Talbanat. The site is known today as the White Monument. Researchers long believed that the mound contained the mass grave of enemy fighters, but recently, archaeologists took a closer look, suggesting that the individuals buried there were actually members of the local community and militia. Similar burials have been found throughout northern Syria, but the White Monument is noticeably different. Unlike the other mass graves, where soldiers' bodies were haphazardly thrown into a pile, the deceased were arranged in an organized fashion after being transported to the site from elsewhere. The careful placement of the bodies indicates that they were held in higher regard than enemy troops, suggesting that the burial is a tribute to the fallen. If this is true, it means that the 4,500-year-old site is the world's oldest war memorial. Speaking with The Guardian, University of Toronto professor Anne Porter pointed out that experts don't know whether the individuals buried at the White Monument are the losers or the victors of the conflict they died in. Either way, she explained, it appears as though they were laid to rest with honor. These findings came to light after researchers re-examined the site, which was first excavated in the 1980s and 90s. The team acknowledged that the new information warrants a deeper investigation of other burial mounds throughout the region, in case previous studies missed important details that could give accurate context to the sites. Thanks for watching. Which one of these sites did you find the most mysterious? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you next time. Bye!